Good morning, everyone. Hope you're doing well today. We'll get back into the 78th Psalm this morning. Psalm 78, we'll be picking up in the 56th verse. The 56th verse. And again, we're looking at a psalm that is um, eerily, strikingly familiar to modern day Christians, or I believe should be, in that Asaph is saying, reminding the Israelites, and by extension, we can eavesdrop and learn something ourselves, that God has been good to his people, even though they tend to be rebellious. They tend to go against his word. He continues to forgive them. They continue to complain. He continues to forgive in an ongoing cycle. And he's particularly been, again, talking about the Exodus, the freedom from the Egyptian bondage, but there are numerous other examples that Asaph could have brought to the conversation, but he has mainly used examples from their history with Egypt and their Egyptian bondage and the plagues and Moses and that to show how the Israelites were continually rebellious. In verse 55, he had reminded the Israelites that God had intervened and drove all of the pagans, the heathens, out of the promised land and given Israel this great land. And then we start verse 56 with a simple little word, yet. If you remember yesterday, I told you verse 55, and don't want to take from or add to the Word of God, but just you could read into that statement, but he cast out the heathen. Asaph had been listing all the things that Israel had done, their failures, their rebellion against God. And in verse 55, he says, but God still cast out the heathen. God still gave them the land. And now in verse 56, we see a similar word that is actually in the text, and that is yet. Um, Verse 55, but God still gave them the promised land. In verse 56, yet they still tempted and provoked the Most High God and kept not his testimony. And so, verse 55 again tells us that God was good. God, in spite of Israel's rebellion, gave them the promised land. In spite of all their many, multiple episodes of rebelling against God, not following his directive, in spite of that, God went ahead and gave them the promised land. And even after giving them the promised land, God still gave them the promised land, and they still continued to tempt him and to provoke him. Verse 57 says, they turned back and dealt unfaithfully like their fathers. They were turned aside like a deceitful bow, for they provoked him to anger with their high places and moved him to jealousy with their graven images. And so, again, if you were to take this whole psalm and read it at one time, Israel was unrighteous, they were unfaithful, they were inconsistent, uh, but God still gave them the promised land. And yet, even after giving them the promised land, they continued in their disobedience. They continued in this pattern of rebelling against God, and again, this nation, this people that has been blessed beyond measure, that God has repeatedly protected and provided for. Repeatedly, uh, they have repeatedly and once again, Asaph says, have turned their back on God. They have failed, it says, to keep His commandments and to keep His word. They turn back, and then really what Asaph is warning against here is in verse 57. They dealt unfaithfully like their fathers. Their fathers failed, and that when their fathers failed and wouldn't go into the promised land, they were afraid to follow God, and God allowed them to wander for 40 years till all the adults died. Then, when Israel finally did go into the promised land, instead of learning from the mistakes of their fathers, they repeated the mistakes of his of their fathers. They verse again 56 says they tempted and provoked, kept not his testimony. They continued to do that. And this word where it says they dealt unfaithfully like their fathers. That the Hebrew word that's used there is the word the same word you'd use in a sentence saying, uh, excuse me, that a husband or wife had been unfaithful by committing adultery to their spouse. And so God, Asaph says that Israel were spiritual adulterers. He compares them to a deceitful bow. I think about um, the old Andy Griffith show, where you might remember the one where Opie went to the carnival trying to win a prize, and he kept shooting the BB gun. When Andy came, they saw that the sights on the gun had been bent a little bit, and so no matter how well you aimed, you were going to miss. Well, that's the same thing you don't hear, a bent bow. That when you aim it and you shoot it, the bow's bent. It's going to go in a different direction. It doesn't go in the right direction. That's what he says about Israel. They don't go in the direction where God aims them. And what was God's aim? God's intention, His aim, was that the Israelites were going to be a holy people, that the Israelites were going to be a peculiar people, that the Israelites were going to be a people that were set aside for Him, be His witnesses in the world. That was His plan for the Israelites, but they had become bent. They had become warped like a deceitful bow. And as they, again, and the thing that is really just mind boggling about this, again, is this was all done after God had given them the promised land. This land that the Bible describes as flowing with milk and honey. He is, get this out of my mouth the way I'm thinking it, he's talking about their ancestors who rebelled on the other side of Jordan before coming into the promised land. But he's talking to the Israelites who have come across and who are now in the promised land and who are being rebellious against the hand of God, in spite of all of His mercy, goodness, and blessings on them. And so I don't think we could be any more clear this morning, with very little commentary on my part, the message of this psalm, the message of this passage that is reminding us that God has been faithful, God has been true. Therefore, as His followers, we should be faithful and true as well. Because of His blessings, because we have witnessed, maybe not necessarily in your your ancestors, maybe all your parents, grandparents, maybe they were all good, godly people, but all of us have witnessed, we have seen ungodly people, and we have seen the consequence. We have seen the price that they pay for their actions, and so therefore. Just like the psalmist, we are reminded then that we should be obedient and faithful servants to God because of His goodness, because of what He's done. Um, we because He has delivered us and provided for us, then we should be known for our faithfulness, for our obedience to the commandments, the directives of God, how we follow His will. And so this morning, as we wrap up this section, I would challenge you, encourage you to do a little inventory and ask ourselves just how faithful are we being to God? How earnestly, how willingly, how completely are we following the directives and the of God that we find laid out in His Word? We, again, the real shame of this to me, the real sad part of this story is again that we're talking about people who God has blessed beyond measure. And then I look and think, well, man, if the Israelites were blessed, how much more is the average person in our world today? How much more do they have than the Israelites could have ever imagined? We are so blessed. God has been so good to us. Let us learn. Let's learn from that and be obedient and faithful servants to Him. All right, you have a great day, and we'll see you back here tomorrow morning.